Hello, everyone. I'm Mr. Edison, and I'm here to guide you into a peaceful slumber. If you find this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know where you're from and what time it is as you unwind. So settle in, get cozy, and let the relaxation begin. Living near Redwood National Park means getting used to shadows. The ancient trees create a perpetual twilight beneath their canopy, turning everyday hikes into journeys through a world of filtered green light and deep, impenetrable darkness. My name is Daniel Hayes, and after 5 years of working as a geological surveyor in the park, I thought I knew every cave, every crevice, every hidden place these mountains had to offer. I was wrong. The discovery happened on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday in October 2023. I was mapping a new series of seasonal streams for the Park Service, following their paths through the understory where sword ferns grew taller than a man. The autumn rains had been heavy that year, washing away topsoil and exposing features that had been hidden for decades, maybe centuries. That's how I found the cave. At first, I nearly missed it. Just another shadow among shadows. But something about the way the ferns grew around it caught my attention. They formed an almost perfect arch, their fronds weaving together in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Behind them, partially obscured by a curtain of moss and wild blackberry vines, was an opening in the rock face. I've explored hundreds of caves in my career. Most are simple solution caves, formed by water-dissolving limestone over millions of years. But this was different. The entrance was perfectly rectangular, about 7 feet high and 4 feet wide. The edges were too straight, too precise. This wasn't natural formation. This was construction. The rational part of my brain immediately started cataloging possibilities. Maybe it was an old mining tunnel, though no mining operations had ever been officially recorded in this part of the park. Could be a Prohibition-era smuggler's cache, or even something older. The indigenous peoples of this region had lived here for thousands of years before European contact. But another part of my brain, a more primitive part that remembered why our ancestors feared the dark, was screaming at me to walk away. There was something wrong about this place. Something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up even in the warm afternoon sun. I marked the location on my GPS unit and took several photos, though for some reason they all came out strangely blurred, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on the entrance. The coordinates themselves seemed to drift, the numbers changing slightly each time I checked them. I told myself it was just signal interference from the dense canopy overhead, but deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that perfectly rectangular entrance kept appearing every time I closed my eyes. I spent hours researching the area's history, looking for any mention of constructed tunnels or caves. Nothing. According to every official record, that part of the park was pristine wilderness, untouched by human development. My sister Emily, who worked as a drone operator for a local news station, noticed my obsession during our weekly dinner. "You're acting weird," she said, watching me scroll through geological survey maps on my phone. "Weirder than usual, I mean." I told her about the cave, showing her the blurry photos. She studied them with professional interest, noting how the distortion seemed centered specifically around the entrance while the surrounding forest was perfectly clear. "Could be some kind of electromagnetic interference," she suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. "Want me to bring the drone out there tomorrow? Get a better look?" I shook my head. Something told me that would be a bad idea, though I couldn't explain why. Instead, I decided to go back the next morning, properly equipped this time. Emily made me promise to check in every hour via satellite phone. She'd always been the cautious one in our family. I arrived at the site just as dawn was breaking through the redwood canopy. The morning fog hung thick between the massive trunks, turning the forest into a maze of grey shadows and muted shapes. My truck was the only vehicle in the small maintenance access lot, its red paint looking almost black in the dim light. The hike to the cave took longer than I remembered. Distances seemed to stretch in the redwoods, as if the ancient trees somehow bend space around them. I'd packed carefully, climbing harness, rope, helmet with mounted LED lights, backup flashlights, first aid kit, water, and emergency rations. The satellite phone sat heavy in my chest pocket, Emily's number pre-programmed for speed dial. When I reached the location I'd marked, something felt different. The ferns that had formed such a perfect arch were now wilted and black, as if they'd been exposed to intense cold. The moss around the entrance had receded, revealing more of the stone frame. In the morning light, I could see details I'd missed before, subtle patterns carved into the rock, geometric shapes that seemed to shift when viewed directly. I set up my rappelling gear, anchoring the rope to one of the smaller redwoods near the entrance. The tree's bark felt unusually warm under my hands, despite the morning chill. As I double-checked my harness, I noticed something odd about the ground around the cave. There were no animal tracks, no signs of wildlife at all. In a forest teeming with life, this small area was completely devoid of activity. Before entering, I called Emily as promised. "I'm going in," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you don't hear from me in an hour—" "Don't," she cut me off. "Just be careful, okay? This whole thing feels wrong." She wasn't wrong. As I approached the entrance, the air temperature dropped dramatically. My breath came out in visible puffs, like standing in front of an open freezer. The LED lights on my helmet illuminated the entrance, but the beam seemed to bend slightly, as if the darkness inside had mass and was refracting the light. The initial tunnel was exactly as I'd suspected, clearly artificial, with smooth walls that bore the same subtle geometric patterns as the entrance. The floor sloped downward at a gentle angle, and I could feel a slight breeze coming from deeper within, carrying a scent I couldn't quite identify. Something metallic, mixed with an organic decay that reminded me of mushrooms after rain. About 50 feet in, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My lights revealed stalactites hanging from the ceiling, but they were wrong somehow. Instead of the random patterns formed by natural water erosion, these formed perfect concentric circles, like ripples in a pond frozen in stone. The floor was unnaturally smooth, almost polished, with thin channels cut into it in complex patterns. That's when I noticed the lanterns. They lined the walls at regular intervals, casting a pale blue-green light that seemed to pulse slightly like a heartbeat. They weren't electric, nor were they any kind of oil or gas lamp I'd ever seen. The light they produced didn't illuminate so much as it seemed to push back the darkness, creating spheres of sickly radiance that hurt my eyes to look at directly. I checked my watch. Only 15 minutes had passed, but something felt off about that. The seconds seemed to tick by too slowly, as if time itself was being stretched thin. I reached for the satellite phone to check in with Emily, but the screen was dead. Not just out of signal, completely dead, as if all power had been drained from it. At the far end of the chamber, I found what appeared to be an elevator shaft. The infrastructure was modern: steel cables, electromagnetic safety brakes, even what looked like a card reader mounted on the wall. But everything was covered in a thin layer of that same black moss I'd seen at the entrance, and the metal had an odd oily sheen to it. I shone my light down the shaft. It descended at least 80 feet, maybe more. The walls were lined with the same strange lanterns, their pulsing light creating a hypnotic pattern that made me dizzy. According to every geological survey, every mining record, every piece of official documentation, this shaft couldn't exist. This entire structure couldn't exist, but it did exist, and something deep inside me knew that whatever I'd stumbled upon was far more significant than a forgotten mining operation or archaeological site. The patterns on the walls, the impossible, stalactites, the modern technology mixed with elements that seemed ancient beyond comprehension, it all pointed to something that defied explanation. I checked my climbing gear one more time and began to rappel down the shaft. The further I descended, the stronger that metallic smell became. The air grew thicker, heavier, making each breath feel like drawing in syrup. The pulsing of the lanterns seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat, creating a disorienting effect that made it difficult to maintain my orientation. The bottom of the shaft opened into a tunnel system that shouldn't have been possible. The walls were lined with the same polished stone as above, but here the geometric patterns were more pronounced, seeming to writhe and shift in my peripheral vision. The air was noticeably warmer, humid in a way that made my skin crawl. The tunnel stretched out before me, perfectly straight and much wider than the one above. The ceiling rose at least 15 feet high, and the floors were impossibly smooth, almost like polished obsidian. My boots made no sound as I walked, as if the material was absorbing all acoustic energy. That's when I heard the scream. It echoed through the tunnels, bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to determine its source. It wasn't the shriek of an animal or the mechanical sound of equipment. It was undeniably human, filled with a terror that made my blood run cold. Every instinct told me to turn back, to climb out of this impossible place and never return. But that scream, it sounded like someone in desperate need of help. I checked my helmet lights, tightened my pack, and moved forward, trying to orient myself toward the sound's origin. The tunnel system formed a grid pattern with intersections at regular intervals. At each junction, more of those pulsing lanterns cast their sickly light, creating pools of illumination that seemed to crawl across the walls. I started marking my path with climbing chalk, though something told me these tunnels might not maintain a consistent layout. After what felt like hours, but my watch insisted was only 20 minutes, I heard voices. Not screams this time, but muffled conversations and the sound of boots on stone. I killed my lights and pressed myself against the wall, the stone unnaturally warm against my back. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the distinct sound of military-grade radio communications, short bursts of static and clipped professional responses. I risked a peek around the corner and immediately wished I hadn't. A massive cavern opened up before me, easily the size of a football field. The ceiling was lost in darkness above, but what caught my attention were the cages, dozens of them, arranged in neat rows like some nightmarish prison block. Each was roughly the size of a shipping container, constructed of a material that looked like steel, but had that same oily sheen I'd noticed on the elevator mechanism. And they weren't empty. People, men, women, even children, all in various states of consciousness. Some were crying, others just staring blankly into space. Many appeared to be sedated, slumped against the bars of their cages. They were dressed in plain grey jumpsuits, each marked with a series of symbols that matched the patterns on the walls. Armed guards patrolled between the rows of cages. They wore black tactical gear without any identifying insignia, carrying weapons that looked like modified M4 carbines, but with strange attachments I'd never seen before. Their movements were too precise, too coordinated, almost mechanical in their efficiency. My hands shaking, I pulled out my phone. The screen was still dead, but I had a backup, a small digital camera I kept in my pack. I raised it slowly, trying to steady my trembling hands. The flash was off, but in my panic to capture what I was seeing, I accidentally bumped the control dial. The flash fired. The cavern lit up like daylight for a split second. Everything froze. The guards, the prisoners, even the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then one of the guards turned, his face mask reflecting the pulsing light of the lanterns, and looked directly at me. I ran. I wish I could say I did something heroic, that I tried to help those people or confronted the guards. But in that moment, pure survival instinct took over. I sprinted back the way I'd come, no longer caring about stealth or marking my path. Behind me I could hear shouting and the sound of boots in pursuit. The tunnels seemed different now, the intersections not quite where I remembered them. The geometric patterns on the walls appeared to be moving faster, more aggressively, as if responding to my panic. The lantern's pulse quickened, matching my racing heartbeat. I ran through the tunnels, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The pursuing footsteps echoed from multiple directions, making it impossible to tell how many were following or how close they were. The patterns on the walls seemed more active now, rippling and flowing like liquid metal, casting disorienting shadows that made it difficult to maintain my sense of direction. By some miracle, or perhaps something worse, I found the elevator shaft. The climbing rope still hung where I'd left it, swaying slightly in a breeze that shouldn't have existed this far underground. As I clipped into my harness, a voice echoed through the tunnels, distorted and inhuman. Containment breach in Sector 7. Initiate Protocol Omega. The lanterns suddenly shifted from their sickly blue-green to a deep, pulsing red. An alarm began to sound, not the traditional blaring you'd expect, but a low, oscillating tone that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I started climbing, pushing my muscles to their limit. Halfway up the shaft, I heard something that made my heart stop. Not the sound of pursuit from below, but movement from above. They were coming down from the entrance too. I was trapped between two groups of whatever these people, if they were people, were. A beam of intense white light shot down from above, nearly blinding me. Voices called out, speaking in what sounded like multiple languages simultaneously, creating a cacophony that made my head spin. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to become as small as possible. That's when I noticed something strange about the shaft walls. The geometric patterns were moving more rapidly now, forming what looked like doorways or windows into somewhere else. Through one, I caught a glimpse of a vast city under an alien sky. Through another, creatures that defied description moved in a landscape of crystalline formations. In my panic, I did something either incredibly stupid or surprisingly clever. I unclipped from my rope and reached for one of these doorways. My hand passed through the wall as if it were made of smoke. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, I pushed myself through. The sensation was indescribable. It felt like being turned inside out while simultaneously being compressed and expanded. Colors that had no names flooded my vision. Sounds that couldn't exist in our universe filled my ears. For what felt like both an eternity and a microsecond, I existed everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I was falling. I hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. When my vision cleared, I found myself lying in the underbrush, about 100 yards from the cave entrance. The sun was setting. Somehow hours had passed. My clothes were covered in a fine, iridescent powder that seemed to evaporate as I watched. The cave entrance was a hive of activity. Black SUVs and unmarked vans had appeared in the normally empty maintenance lot. Men in hazmat suits were setting up portable lights and what looked like scientific equipment. Others, wearing the same tactical gear as the underground guards, had established a perimeter. I stayed low and crawled through the undergrowth, using my years of experience in these woods to move as silently as possible. Once I was sure I wasn't being followed, I ran to my truck. The key was still in my pocket, though it felt strangely warm to the touch. I drove home in a daze, taking back roads and constantly checking my rearview mirror. My phone had mysteriously reactivated, showing 17 missed calls from Emily. The clock read 8:47 p.m. I'd been in those tunnels for over 12 hours, though it felt like only minutes had passed. Emily was waiting on my porch when I pulled up, her face pale with worry. "Where the hell have you been?" she demanded. "I tried calling the park service, but they said they had no record of you checking in today." I was about to call the police. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe what I'd seen? The cages, the impossible doorways, the things I'd glimpsed through those geometric patterns. It all sounded insane, even to me. That's when I noticed the black car parked across the street. The black sedan sat there like a predator waiting to strike. Its windows tinted so dark they seemed to absorb light. Two figures sat motionless in the front seats, their silhouettes unnaturally still. "Get inside," I whispered to Emily, trying to keep my voice steady. "Don't look at them." Once inside, I locked every door and drew all the blinds. Emily watched me with growing concern as I checked and rechecked the windows, making sure they were secure. "Danny, you're scaring me," she said. "What happened out there?" I connected my camera to my laptop with trembling hands. Most of the photos were corrupted, pixelated masses of color and static, but one had survived. The flash photo from the cavern, blurry but clear enough to show the cages, the guards, the prisoners. Emily's face went pale as she studied it. "This is impossible," she whispered. "That cave system isn't on any of the park's geological surveys. I've done drone mapping of that entire area. There's nothing but solid rock for miles." "They're not geological," I said, my voice hoarse. "Those tunnels, they're something else, something old. The people down there are just using them." I told her everything, the impossible geometry, the strange lanterns, the glimpses of other worlds through those moving patterns. As I spoke, the lights in my house began to flicker, subtle at first but growing more noticeable. Emily checked her phone. "No signal," she said, "and my Wi-Fi's gone too." The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, our breath visible in the increasingly cold air. A high-pitched whine, just at the edge of hearing, began to fill the house. It reminded me of the sound in the tunnels, that oscillating tone that seemed to vibrate in your bones. "We need to go," I started to say, but it was too late. There was a knock at the door, 3 precise taps evenly spaced. Then silence. We froze, hardly daring to breathe. The knocking came again, in exactly the same pattern. Through a gap in the blinds, I could see more black cars had arrived, forming a loose circle around my house. "Mr. Hayes," a voice called out. It sounded almost human, but something was off about it, like someone reading phonetically from a script, not quite understanding the words. "We need to discuss what you witnessed today." Emily grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in painfully. "Danny, look!" The envelope had appeared on my dining room table. Neither of us had seen it arrive, had heard anyone enter. It just was there where moments before there had been nothing. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside were photos, dozens of them. Me entering the cave, me in the tunnels, me during moments I had no memory of, in places that couldn't exist. And most terrifying of all, photos of me taken through my own windows over the past several weeks before I'd even discovered the cave. They hadn't been following me because of what I'd found. I'd found the cave because they had been following me. The knocking came again, more insistent now. The lights flickered more violently, and that high-pitched whine grew louder. Objects in the room began to vibrate, pictures rattling on walls, glasses humming on shelves. "Mr. Hayes," the voice called again. "We've been watching you for some time. You have certain qualities that interest us." The geometric patterns I'd seen in the cave began to appear on my walls, flowing and shifting like living things. The room's shadows deepened, took on weight and substance. That metallic smell from the tunnels filled the air. Emily clutched my arm tighter. "Danny, the windows..." Beyond the glass, the world had changed. The street, the neighboring houses, even the sky, all had been replaced by that same alien landscape I'd glimpsed through the doorway in the shaft. Crystalline structures rose into a purple-black sky lit by 3 moons of impossible colors. The front door began to open, though I knew I'd locked it. The hinges creaked with a sound that seemed to come from very far away. In the doorway stood 2 figures in black suits, their proportions subtly wrong, as if they were wearing human bodies that didn't quite fit. "It's time, Mr. Hayes," they said in perfect unison, their voices overlapping in a way that made my ears hurt. "Time to see what lies beneath." The agents, if that's what they were, moved with perfect synchronization, their steps leaving small ripples in reality, like stones dropped in a pond. Their faces were too smooth, too symmetrical, as if they'd been crafted by someone who'd only seen humans in photographs. "Emily, run," I whispered. But when I turned to look at her, she wasn't moving. She stood frozen, like a paused video frame. In fact, everything except me and the agent seemed to have stopped. Dust motes hung suspended in the air, the flickering lights caught in mid-flash. "Time is such a limiting construct," one agent said, its voice modulating between frequencies that shouldn't have been possible for human vocal cords to produce. "We exist outside such limitations," the other continued, its mouth moving a fraction of a second after the words were heard. The geometric patterns on my walls were spreading now, covering everything in flowing symbols that hurt my eyes to look at directly. Through them, I could see other versions of my living room, some subtle variations, others radically different. In one, the house had been abandoned for decades. In another, it was underwater. In yet another, it hadn't been built at all, and primordial forests stretched as far as the eye could see. "The cave was a test," they said together. "One of many doors we've opened. We needed to see how you would react." "The others," I managed to say, thinking of the people in cages. "What did you do to them?" "The agents. We've been watching humanity for a very long time," they said, "waiting for individuals who could perceive the true nature of reality without breaking. You're not the first, but you are rare." My head was pounding now, blood trickling from my nose as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The agents moved closer, their forms becoming less and less human with each step. "You have a choice, Mr. Hayes," they said, their voices now carrying harmonics that made my teeth vibrate. "You can come with us willingly, help us understand how your mind can accommodate these truths, or—" They gestured at the frozen form of Emily, at the suspended world around us. "Or we can erase all of this, replace it with a reality where you never found the cave, where you lived a normal, limited life. But deep down, you'll always know something is missing. You'll feel the edges where we stitched your new reality together." The patterns on the walls were moving faster now, the glimpses of other worlds becoming more frequent, more intense. I could feel my grip on this reality starting to slip, my consciousness trying to expand, to accommodate the impossible things I was witnessing. In that moment, suspended between realities, I looked at Emily's frozen form. My sister, who had always been there for me, who had tried to warn me about the cave. Then I looked at the agents, their human disguises now barely containing the cosmic horror beneath. "If I go with you," I said, my voice steady despite my terror, "what happens to her?" "To everyone who knows me." "They will remember a different story," they said in unison. "A tragic but mundane one. A hiking accident, perhaps. A body never found. Life will continue in its linear fashion for them." I thought about the people in the cages, their blank stares and silent screams. Had they been given this same choice? Had they refused and been imprisoned instead? Or were they failed experiments, minds shattered by exposure to truths they couldn't handle? "Time to decide, Mr. Hayes," the agent said. The room was almost completely dissolved now, reality peeling away like layers of old wallpaper, revealing the vast cosmic architecture beyond. I'm leaving this account as a warning, though I know it will be found too late. By the time anyone reads this, the reality where Daniel Hayes discovered a strange cave in Redwood National Park will have been carefully excised from the timeline, replaced with a neater, simpler story. To whoever finds this, if you ever notice patterns in the shadows that shouldn't be there, if you ever catch glimpses of impossible geometries in the corner of your eye, if you ever find a perfectly rectangular cave that doesn't appear on any map, run. The doors they've opened work both ways, and not everything that comes through them wears a human face. They're watching us, have always been watching us, waiting for minds that can expand enough to comprehend their reality without breaking. And when they find one, they add it to their collection. Emily, if by some miracle you remember enough to recognize this truth, I'm sorry. I made my choice. I just hope that in some version of reality, somewhere beyond the veil, we're still having our weekly dinners, still arguing about normal things, still blissfully unaware of what lurks beneath the surface of our world. The agents are here now. The patterns are everywhere. The door is opening, and I'm walking through. Faces rippled, momentarily revealing something underneath that made my mind recoil. They failed the test, they said. Their minds couldn't adapt to seeing beyond the veil. But you passed through one of our doorways. You saw other realms and retained your sanity, mostly. I backed away from them, but space itself seemed to bend around their presence. Each step I took somehow brought me closer to them, instead of further away. The cave isn't just a facility, the first agent said. It's an intersection, the second continued. A point where multiple realities touch. They finished together. The room around us began to dissolve, the walls becoming transparent, revealing layer upon layer of other spaces beyond. I saw vast cities built from crystalline structures that defied physics. I saw oceans of liquid metal under skies filled with geometric shapes instead of stars. I saw things moving between these layers, vast intelligences that regarded our universe as we might regard a petri dish. We've been watching humanity for a very long time, they said, waiting for individuals who could perceive the true nature of reality without breaking. You're not the first, but you are rare. My head was pounding now, blood trickling from my nose, as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The agents moved closer, their forms becoming less and less human with each step. You have a choice, Mr. Hayes, they said, their voices now carrying harmonics that made my teeth vibrate. You can come with us willingly. Help us understand how your mind can accommodate these truths, or... They gestured at the frozen form of Emily, at the suspended world around us. Or we can erase all of this, replace it with a reality where you never found the cave, where you lived a normal, limited life. But deep down, you'll always know something is missing. You'll feel the edges, where we stitched your new reality together. The patterns on the walls were moving faster now, the glimpses of other worlds becoming more frequent, more intense. I could feel my grip on this reality starting to slip, my consciousness trying to expand to accommodate the impossible things I was witnessing. In that moment, suspended between realities, I looked at Emily's frozen form, my sister who had always been there for me, who had tried to warn me about the cave. Then I looked at the agents, their human disguises now barely containing the cosmic horror beneath. If I go with you, I said, my voice steady despite my terror. What happens to her? To everyone who knows me? They will remember a different story, they said in unison. A tragic but mundane one. A hiking accident, perhaps. A body never found. Life will continue in its linear fashion for them. I thought about the people in the cages, their blank stares and silent screams. Had they been given this same choice? Had they refused and been imprisoned instead? Or were they failed experiments, minds shattered by exposure to truths they couldn't handle? Time to decide, Mr. Hayes, the agent said. The room was almost completely dissolved now, reality peeling away like layers of old wallpaper, revealing the vast cosmic architecture beyond. I'm leaving this account as a warning, though I know it will be found too late. By the time anyone reads this, the reality where Daniel Hayes discovered a strange cave in Redwood National Park will have been carefully excised from the timeline, replaced with a neater, simpler story. To whoever finds this, if you ever notice patterns in the shadows that shouldn't be there, if you ever catch glimpses of impossible geometries in the corner of your eye, if you ever find a perfectly rectangular cave that doesn't appear on any map, run. The doors they've opened work both ways, and not everything that comes through them wears a human face. They're watching us, have always been watching us, waiting for minds that can expand enough to comprehend their reality without breaking. And when they find one, they add it to their collection. Emily, if by some miracle you remember enough to recognize this truth, I'm sorry. I made my choice. I just hope that in some version of reality, somewhere beyond the veil, we're still having our weekly dinners, still arguing about normal things, still blissfully unaware of what lurks beneath the surface of our world. The agents are here now. The patterns are everywhere. The door is opening, and I'm walking through. That morning had started like any other Thursday in September. I was rushing around my apartment, trying to gather my things for my morning classes at Cascade Community College. The familiar smell of coffee filled the small kitchen as I stuffed notebooks into my backpack, already running late. That's when my mother showed up unannounced, as she often did since Dad passed away last year. "Mira," she called through the screen door. "Let me in, sweetheart. I brought you something." Mom always looked out of place in my somewhat shabby apartment complex with her carefully coordinated outfits and perfectly maintained hair. Today, she wore one of her real estate agent suits, navy blue with gold buttons, and carried a small paper bag from the hardware store. "I can't stay long, Mom," I said, letting her in. "I've got Professor Martinez's class in 30 minutes, and you know how he is about tardiness." She waved away my protests, setting her oversized purse on my kitchen counter. "This will just take a minute." From the paper bag, she pulled out a small black flashlight. It looked expensive, the kind with multiple settings and an emergency strobe feature. "I want you to carry this." I tried not to roll my eyes. Ever since the incident in the college parking lot last month, just some drunk guy asking for directions, nothing serious, she'd been increasingly worried about my night classes. "Mom, campus security." I know. She cut me off, pressing the flashlight into my hand. "Campus security does regular patrols. The parking lot is well lit." "You've told me, but humor your mother, please." Her voice caught slightly on the last word, and I saw that familiar look of worry in her eyes. The same one she'd worn through Dad's final months. The flashlight was surprisingly heavy for its size, solidly built with a textured grip. "It's got a strobe setting," Mom explained, demonstrating how to activate it. "Shine it in someone's face if they're creeping around. It'll disorient them long enough for you to get away." I almost laughed at how serious she was about it, but something in her expression stopped me. Instead, I slipped the flashlight into my jacket pocket and gave her a quick hug. "Thanks, Mom. I'll keep it with me." She smiled, relief evident on her face. "That's all I ask. Oh, and don't forget, dinner on Sunday. I'm making lasagna." As I watched her drive away in her immaculately maintained Volvo, I had no idea that small flashlight would become so important just 12 hours later. The day passed in a blur of lectures and study sessions. I'd been taking extra classes this semester, trying to finish my prerequisites for nursing school. Between work at the coffee shop and my full course load, I barely had time to breathe, let alone worry about personal safety. The flashlight sat forgotten in my jacket pocket until evening, when I got a text from my friend Chris. "Still up for our Thursday trail run? Luna needs her exercise and I need to vent about work." I almost said no. I had a paper due Monday for my anatomy class, and the weather forecast wasn't great. But Chris had been my best friend since high school, and our weekly hikes were sometimes the only thing that kept me sane during particularly stressful weeks. Plus, Luna, his miniature schnauzer, was basically my part-time therapy dog. "Meet you at the Oak Ridge lot at 6? I texted back, "Perfect. Luna says you better bring treats." I smiled, picturing his dog's expectant face. Luna was the most spoiled schnauzer in the Pacific Northwest, and I was partially to blame. As I gathered my hiking clothes, I transferred the flashlight from my jacket to my small day pack. Another decision that would prove more significant than I could have imagined. Oak Ridge State Park sprawled across nearly 5,000 acres of old-growth forest, but most visitors stuck to the main loop trail, a well-maintained 5-mile path that wound through towering Douglas firs and western red cedars. Chris and I had been hiking this trail every Thursday for the past 2 years, watching it change through the seasons. We'd seen it draped in spring wildflowers, baking under summer sun, and buried under winter snow. But something about the trail felt different that evening. The parking lot was unusually empty when I pulled in at 6:05 p.m. Normally, there'd be at least a dozen cars, hardcore trail runners getting in their evening exercise, families finishing up their afternoon walks, amateur photographers catching the golden hour light. Today, there were only 3 vehicles: my beat-up Honda Civic, Chris's Subaru Outback, and a dark sedan I didn't recognize, parked in the furthest corner of the lot. Chris was waiting by the trailhead, Luna dancing around his feet in excitement. He looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from too many hours staring at computer screens and dealing with office politics. At 32, he was a few years older than me, but lately the startup life had been aging him faster than normal. "You look like hell," I said by way of greeting, crouching down to give Luna her expected belly rubs. "Thanks for the confidence boost," he replied, managing a weak smile. "You tried dealing with Silicon Valley types who think sleep is for the weak." He ran a hand through his perpetually messy brown hair. "The new manager, Derek? He's been scheduling meetings at 6 a.m. to sync with the California office." Luna interrupted his complaint by shoving her nose into my backpack, clearly searching for the treats she knew I'd brought. I pulled out a couple of her favorite bacon-flavored biscuits, watching her precise, ladylike way of taking them from my hand. For a dog that looked like a scrappy dust mop, she had surprisingly refined manners. "Ready?" Chris asked, checking his Apple Watch. "Sun's setting earlier these days. We should probably do the shorter loop." I nodded, falling into step beside him as we started up the trail. The first half-mile was a gentle incline, the path wide and well-marked. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy high above, creating shifting patterns on the ground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves, that particular autumn smell that always reminded me of new notebooks and fresh starts. "So tell me about this manager from hell," I prompted as we walked. Chris needed to vent, and I needed a distraction from thinking about my upcoming anatomy exam. He launched into a detailed description of the latest workplace drama, something about unrealistic deadlines and competing visions for their project. I half-listened, noting how the forest was changing around us as we climbed higher. The friendly, park-like atmosphere of the lower trail was giving way to something older, more primeval. The trees here were ancient giants, their trunks wider than cars, their lowest branches starting 50 feet up. And then he had the nerve to suggest we work through the weekend, Chris was saying, as we reached Cedar Point, a natural overlook about 2 miles in, like we're all single 20-somethings with nothing better to do than debug his pet features. We paused at the viewpoint, catching our breath. The valley spread out below us, the town's lights just starting to twinkle on in the gathering dusk. A cool breeze carried the promise of rain, and heavy clouds were building on the western horizon. Earlier than the forecast had predicted, Luna, who had been happily exploring the trail edges, suddenly stopped and stared into the deeper forest. Her ears pricked forward, and a low whine escaped her throat. "What is it, girl?" Chris asked, instantly alert. Luna wasn't prone to nervousness. We'd encountered deer, raccoons, and even a black bear on these trails, and she'd always remained calm. We stood quietly, listening. The normal evening sounds of the forest, bird calls, rustling leaves, the distant hammering of woodpeckers, had gone silent. It was the kind of stillness that typically preceded a storm, but something about it felt wrong. "We should probably head back," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "It's getting dark faster than I thought." Chris checked his watch again. "Yeah, you're right. We've got maybe 40 minutes of usable light left." We turned back toward the trailhead, picking up our pace slightly. The clouds were moving in faster now, thick grey masses that further dimmed the fading daylight. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I zipped up my fleece jacket, grateful for its warmth. That's when Luna froze again, this time staring intently down the trail ahead of us. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound I'd never heard her make before. And there, in the gathering gloom about 100 yards ahead, we saw the figure. The figure ahead moved with an unnatural slowness, like someone trying very hard to appear casual. In the dimming light, details were difficult to make out, but several things immediately struck me as wrong. His clothing, for one, instead of hiking gear or athletic wear, he wore what appeared to be business casual attire, dark slacks, a light-colored button-down shirt, leather shoes that were completely inappropriate for trail conditions. That's Odd, Chris muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Luna's growl had subsided to a constant low rumble, her body rigid with tension. I reached into my backpack and found the flashlight my mother had given me that morning. It felt reassuringly solid in my hand, heavier than it looked. The beam, when I switched it on, was surprisingly powerful, cutting through the growing darkness like a laser. The man was about 50 yards ahead now, and with the flashlight's illumination, I could see him more clearly. He was broad-shouldered and tall, probably around 6 feet, with grey hair cut in an expensive-looking style. Everything about him seemed carefully maintained. His posture, his clothing, his measured pace. He could have stepped out of a corporate boardroom, which made his presence here at this hour all the more disturbing. Most striking was his complete lack of equipment. No flashlight, no water bottle, no backpack. Nothing that anyone with even basic hiking experience would carry, especially this late in the day. He seemed utterly unconcerned about the approaching darkness or the weather, maintaining that same deliberate pace. "Maybe we should wait here for a bit," Chris suggested. "Let him get further ahead." But before we could decide, my finger slipped on the flashlight switch, plunging us into sudden darkness. It was only for a few seconds, but when I managed to turn it back on, everything had changed. The man had stopped walking. He stood perfectly still in the middle of the trail, his back still to us. Then, with a movement that seemed too quick, too fluid to be natural, he stepped to the side of the path. As he moved, he raised something to his ear, a phone, presumably, but his posture was wrong for someone making a call. His head was tilted at an odd angle, his free arm hanging too stiffly at his side. "Good evening," he called out, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. It was cultured, pleasant even, but had an underlying quality that set my teeth on edge. "Beautiful night for a walk, isn't it?" Luna's growl intensified, and Chris grabbed her collar to keep her from lunging forward. I kept the flashlight beam trained on the man, noticing how he seemed to lean slightly away from the light, though his face remained in shadow. "Just heading back to our car," Chris replied, his voice steady despite the tension I could feel radiating from him. "Getting pretty dark for hiking." "Oh, I don't mind the dark," the man said, and there was something wrong about how he formed the words, as if he was trying to remember how human speech worked. "In fact, I prefer it. Helps you see things as they really are." He appeared to be typing something on his phone, but his fingers moved too rapidly, almost blur-like in their speed. Luna barked suddenly, a sharp, aggressive sound completely unlike her usual friendly woofing. "Ah, she's an ankle-biter," the man said, and I noticed he'd stopped pretending to use his phone. His head turned toward us with that same unnatural quickness, and for a moment I thought I saw his eyes reflect the flashlight beam like an animal's. Every instinct was screaming at me to run. The rational part of my mind tried to argue that he was probably just an eccentric businessman taking a badly planned walk, but something deeper, more primitive, knew better. This wasn't right. He wasn't right. We need to move. Now. Chris's voice was barely a whisper, but the urgency in it spurred me into action. Without taking my flashlight off the man, we began backing away, trying to maintain what felt like a safe distance. The stranger remained perfectly still, his head cocked at that impossible angle, but I could feel his attention on us, like a physical weight. Luna's growls had turned into a continuous low warning sound I'd never heard her make before, halfway between a whine and a snarl. And when we were about 30 yards away, I saw his shoulders shift in a way that human shoulders shouldn't be able to move. That was all it took. Without a word, Chris and I turned and ran. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as we sprinted down the trail, casting crazy shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees casting them. Luna ran beside us, no longer growling, but moving with focused intensity. The trail that we knew so well suddenly felt alien and treacherous. Roots seemed to appear out of nowhere, branches whipped at our faces. "Don't look back," Chris panted as we ran. "Whatever you do, don't look back." But of course I did. The man was following us, but not in any way that made sense. He moved in long, fluid strides that covered too much ground, his body swaying in a way that suggested extra joints, or perhaps fewer than normal. He wasn't running exactly. It was more like he was flowing down the trail, eating up the distance between us with terrible efficiency. "He's gaining," I gasped, my lungs burning. The parking lot was still at least 5 minutes away at a normal pace. In the growing darkness, the trail seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us. Chris grabbed my arm, pulling me along faster. The flashlight beam caught glimpses of things moving in the forest beside the trail, shadows that didn't match the trees, casting them, shapes that disappeared when looked at directly. The temperature had dropped even further, and our breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. Behind us, I heard something that might have been laughter, but it sounded wrong, like someone trying to recreate the sound after only reading about it in books. It echoed through the trees in a way that violated the laws of acoustics, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. Luna suddenly veered off the trail, taking a deer path that we knew was a shortcut to the parking lot. We followed without hesitation, crashing through underbrush and sliding down steep slopes. The route was treacherous in daylight. In near darkness, it was almost suicidal. But fear drove us forward. Fear of what was behind us. Fear of what would happen if it caught up. My flashlight caught glimpses of the man through the trees, but his movements made less and less sense. Sometimes he seemed to be on all fours, sometimes impossibly tall, his limbs too long and jointed in the wrong places. He never made any sound beyond that terrible not-quite laughter, but the forest itself seemed to react to his presence, branches creaking in windless air, leaves rustling in unnatural patterns. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, we burst out of the forest near the parking lot. The lot's single security light cast a sickly yellow glow over the nearly empty space. Our cars sat where we'd left them, and the dark sedan was gone. "Keys!" Chris gasped. "Get your keys out!" I fumbled in my pocket, nearly dropping them as my shaking hands tried to find the right one. We were almost to my Honda when I heard it, the sound of something emerging from the forest behind us. The man stepped out of the shadows, moving with that same fluid grace that suggested his bones weren't quite solid. He was walking directly toward us, covering ground far too quickly for his apparently casual pace. In the harsh parking lot light, his face looked wrong, the features slightly misaligned, as if they'd been arranged by someone who'd only seen humans in photographs. "Get in! Get in!" I fumbled with my keys, finally managing to unlock the doors. Chris practically threw Luna into the back seat before diving into the passenger side. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands shaking so badly I nearly missed. The man was halfway across the parking lot now, and in the harsh fluorescent light, his movement became even more disturbing. Each step covered too much ground, as if the space between him and us was somehow condensing. His face had lost all pretense of humanity. The features seemed to shift and flow like wax melting under intense heat. The engine roared to life just as he reached the back of the car. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of his eyes, no longer attempting to look human. They were silver white and had vertical pupils that reflected my taillights like a cat's. His mouth opened in what might have been a smile, revealing too many teeth arranged in ways that defied anatomy. "Drive!" Chris shouted, his voice cracking with panic. Luna was whimpering in the back seat, pressed as far away from the rear window as she could get. I slammed the car into reverse, then drive, tires squealing on the asphalt. As we peeled out of the parking lot, I saw the man standing perfectly still, watching us leave. He raised one hand in what might have been a wave, but his fingers moved independently of each other, like tentacles or serpents. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes of the drive, the only sounds being our ragged breathing and Luna's continued whimpers. I took a deliberately confusing route home, making random turns through residential neighborhoods, constantly checking the rearview mirror for headlights. Finally, Chris broke the silence. What was that?" I shook my head, unable to find words. My hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. I don't know. I don't want to know. Did you see how he moved? And his face... Chris stopped, swallowing hard. His face wasn't right. That night, neither of us slept. I stayed at Chris's apartment, neither of us wanting to be alone. We sat in his living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. Luna refused to leave our sides, pressing herself against our legs as if trying to protect us. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was someone playing a cruel prank. Maybe the strange movements and impossible features were tricks of the light and our fear-addled minds. But we both knew better. What we'd encountered on that trail wasn't human, had probably never been human. The next day, we looked up the trail's history. What we found disturbed us even more. Over the past 50 years, there had been a series of disappearances in Oak Ridge State Park. Always in the evening, always single hikers or pairs. The missing persons reports described similar details. A well-dressed man seen on the trail, strange movements, impossible speeds. We never hiked that trail again. Chris eventually moved to Portland for a new job, taking Luna with him. I switched to morning classes and bought a treadmill for exercise. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that evening. Sometimes, when I'm driving home late at night, I catch glimpses of someone walking with that same fluid grace, that same too-quick movement. And sometimes in my dreams, I hear that terrible not-quite laughter echoing through the trees. The flashlight my mother gave me sits in a drawer now, unused. But sometimes, late at night, I could swear I see its beam shining under the drawer's edge, as if it's turned itself on. And in those moments, I remember the way that thing's eyes reflected the light. And I wonder if by illuminating the darkness that night, we hadn't just revealed what was hiding there, we'd attracted its attention. Mom still asks why I don't hike anymore. I tell her I'm too busy, that I prefer the gym now. It's easier than explaining the truth, that some trails lead to places we're not meant to go, and some creatures that walk them were never meant to be seen by human eyes. But I know it's still out there, walking those darkening paths with its not-quite-human grace, waiting for more hikers to stay just a little too late on the trail. And sometimes, on particularly dark evenings, I think I see movement outside my window, a tall figure standing too still, watching with silver-white eyes that reflect light in ways they shouldn't. There's something special about the way Southern Baptist preachers tell stories. They have a rhythm to their words, a cadence that draws you in like a spider drawing flies into its web. My papa, Reverend James Marshall, was no exception. He'd been preaching fire and brimstone at the First Baptist Church of Thibodaux for over 40 years, his voice carrying the weight of both divine authority and Bayou wisdom. I remember the night he first told us about the creature. It was during our annual family reunion at his house on the outskirts of town, where the paved roads give way to gravel and the streetlights surrender to the natural darkness of the swamp. All the cousins had gathered on the screened-in back porch, the August air thick enough to cut with a knife. The adults were inside, their laughter and conversation providing a backdrop to Papa's story. He sat in his old rocking chair, the same one he'd used to rock all his grandchildren to sleep. At 78, his face was deeply lined, but his eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had guided his congregation through decades of spiritual warfare. The ceiling fan spun lazily above us, doing little to dispel the humidity that made our clothes stick to our skin. "Y'all want to hear about something that happened to me and Uncle Benny back in '85? He asked, his voice dropping to that particular tone that meant a serious story was coming. We all leaned in closer. Papa's stories were usually about hunting or fishing or his days as a young preacher, but something in his expression told us this was different. My cousin Sarah, always the skeptic despite being raised on church and catfish, settled cross-legged on the floor near his feet. "Is this going to be another story about the massive bass that got away?" she teased. Papa's face remained serious. "No, child. This is about something else entirely. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about God's creation. The porch fell silent, except for the chorus of cicadas and the distant splash of something moving in the bayou. Even the adults inside seemed to quiet down, as if they too were waiting to hear what Papa had to say. "Before I start," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "you all need to understand something. What I'm about to tell you isn't just a story. It's not something I made up to scare you or teach you a lesson. This is something that really happened to me and Benny Thompson, God rest his soul, back when we had that fishing camp on Bayou Lafourche." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. You know, Benny never did talk about it much, not even after all these years. But with him gone now, I reckon somebody needs to tell it. Folks need to know what's out there in those swamps. The screens of the porch filtered the moonlight, casting striped shadows across Papa's face. A mockingbird called from somewhere in the darkness, its song carrying across the still night air. Papa took a long sip from his sweet tea, the ice cubes clinking against the glass. "It was late August, kind of like now," he began. "The kind of heat that makes you wonder if hell might be cooler. Benny and I had been fishing all day, bringing in catfish and bass. We had that little camp then, the one your daddy helped me build, Tommy." He nodded at my older cousin. "Just a simple place, but it was our retreat from the world. A place where a couple of old friends could fish and talk about life." Sarah shifted closer, her earlier skepticism forgotten. "Was this before or after you baptized Uncle Benny?" "After," Papa said, a small smile crossing his face. "Benny had been saved about 3 years by then. Used to joke that fishing with a preacher meant Jesus would always help us find the best spots." His smile faded. "But what we found that night, well, that was something else entirely. The camp wasn't much to look at," Papa continued, his rocking chair creaking in rhythm with his words. "Just a single-room structure built up on stilts to keep it above the flood line. Had a little generator for electricity, propane stove for cooking, and a water pump that brought up groundwater so murky you had to boil it twice before drinking." My younger cousin Michael, only 12 at the time, interrupted. "Was it scary out there, Papa?" Papa's weathered hands gripped the arms of his rocker. "Son, the bayou ain't scary unless you don't respect it. It's like the good book says, God gave man dominion over the beasts of the field and the fish of the sea. But dominion don't mean foolishness. You respect what's out there, and mostly it'll respect you back." He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. That particular day had been hotter than usual, even for August. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the water like it's trying to escape to heaven. Benny and I had been out since dawn, working the deeper channels where the big catfish hide. The fishing had been good, real good. We'd pulled in enough channel cats to fill 2 coolers, including one monster that must have gone 15 pounds. Benny always said it was the prayer we said before putting our lines in that brought us luck. But I suspect it had more to do with the chicken liver we used for bait. The ceiling fan wobbled slightly as it spun, creating moving shadows that danced across Papa's face. Outside, a bullfrog started its evening song, its deep croaking carrying across the water. By sunset, we'd cleaned our catch and fired up the propane stove. There's nothing in this world quite like fresh-caught catfish fried in cornmeal, especially when you're eating it right there on the water where you caught it. Benny had brought some of his wife's potato salad and a jar of those pickled okra she was famous for. Sarah pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "Were you scared to be out there alone?" Papa shook his head slowly. "No, child, not then. We'd stayed at that camp hundreds of times. Known every bend in the bayou, every cypress knee, every alligator hole within 5 miles. The locals knew us. The Thibodeau family down the water would wave whenever we passed, and old Marcel Bro would sometimes stop by in his pirogue to trade fish stories." He paused, taking another sip of his tea. "Besides, we weren't completely alone. The bayou's never quiet, not really. There's always something moving, always something making noise. Frogs singing, fish jumping, maybe a raccoon shuffling through the undergrowth looking for crawfish. It's when things get quiet that you need to worry." The porch had grown darker as he talked, the sunset fading into true night. The security light on the corner of the house cast a yellow glow that barely reached us, leaving most of the porch in shadow. Someone inside laughed, the sound muffled through the walls, but none of us turned to look. After supper, Benny and I sat out on the little deck, watching the stars come out. The mosquitoes were fierce, but we'd sprayed ourselves down good with Deep Woods Off. Didn't help much with the nauseums, but nothing ever does. We talked about the usual things, church business, our grandkids, the rumors about how the paper mill up in Lockport might be closing. Papa's rocking slowed, then stopped. That's when things started to feel different. The night sounds changed. Not all at once, mind you, subtle-like. First the frogs got quiet, then the crickets. Even the mosquitoes seemed to disappear. It was like everything in the swamp was holding its breath. The ceiling fan chose that moment to give a particularly loud creak, making several of us jump. Outside, the real bayou had gone surprisingly quiet, as if it too was listening to Papa's story. We didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes things go quiet when a big gator's moving through, or if a bobcat's on the prowl. But this was different. This silence had weight to it. Made the air feel thick, like right before a summer storm. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky, just stars and a moon so bright it cast shadows through the cypress trees. Must have been around midnight when I needed to use the bathroom, Papa continued, his voice growing softer, making us lean in closer. We had one of those chemical toilets inside, but I preferred to step outside when possible. The night air helped keep you alert. Out there, you always wanted to stay alert. The screened porch had grown darker still, and someone had turned off the lights inside the house. Only the security light remained, creating deep shadows in the corners. A moth fluttered against the screen, its wings making soft pattering sounds in the quiet. I'd just finished my business and was heading back inside when I heard it. Not a splash like a gator, not rustling like a coon. This was different. Sounded almost like someone talking, but not quite right. Like someone trying to speak underwater maybe, all gurgled and wrong. My cousin Tommy shifted uncomfortably. Could it have been someone camping nearby? Papa shook his head slowly. Son, we knew everyone who had camps on that stretch of bayou. Nearest one was the Thibodeau place, nearly 2 miles downstream. This was closer, much closer. He leaned forward, the rocker creaking ominously. Then came the sounds of something moving around the camp. Not walking exactly, more like shuffling, dragging itself. And all the while, that weird mumbling continued. I woke Benny up. Didn't have to try hard. He was already stirring from the noise. We had a big flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights that could double as a club if needed. Benny grabbed it while I tried to peer out the window. Papa's hands gripped the arms of his rocker tighter. That's when we saw it. The moon was bright enough to see shapes, but we needed the flashlight to really make it out. Shouldn't have used it. Some things you're better off not seeing clearly. The porch had grown so quiet we could hear the ice slowly melting in Papa's tea glass. Even the night insects seemed to have gone silent, as if they too were waiting to hear what happened next. At first glance, it looked like a man. That's what threw us off. Thought maybe it was some poor soul who'd gotten lost. Maybe someone who'd had too much to drink and wandered off from one of the camps downstream. It was naked as a jaybird, skin so pale it seemed to glow in the moonlight. Could see every rib, every bone, like it was starving. But something wasn't right about the way it moved. The proportions were all wrong. Arms too long, legs bent at angles that'd make a doctor faint. And it was going through our trash, not like a human would, but like an animal, face first, making these wet, smacking sounds. Sarah had pulled her legs tighter to her chest, her earlier skepticism completely gone. What did you do? Well, Papa sighed, we did about the stupidest thing we could have done. We decided to confront it. See, we didn't have any real weapons at the camp, never needed them before. But we had this old broom handle, and in the dark, it might look enough like a shotgun to scare off whatever it was. He paused, taking a long drink of tea, his hand trembling slightly. The window we were looking through didn't open, so we had to go out the front door and around the side of the camp. Benny had the flashlight, I had the broom handle. We were both trying to be quiet, but our hearts were pounding so hard, I swear you could have heard them across the bayou. When we got around to the back of the camp, Benny raised that flashlight, and I pointed the broom handle like it was my old Remington. I tried to sound authoritative, like I did from the pulpit. "Son," I called out, "this is private property and you need to leave now." Papa's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. That's when it turned around. And Lord help me, I'll never forget what we saw. Papa's hands were shaking visibly now as he continued. The ice in his glass had completely melted, but he didn't seem to notice. Outside, even the cicadas had gone quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath. "When that thing stood up," he said, his voice rough with remembered terror, "it just kept going up and up. Had to be over 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8. But the height wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was how it moved." He closed his eyes for a moment as if seeing it again in his mind. Its joints. They didn't work like they should. Knees and elbows bent backwards, then forwards, like they couldn't decide which way was natural. The arms hung down past its knees, fingers too long, and too many of them, moving like pale spiders in the flashlight beam. My younger cousin Michael had pressed himself against his older sister's side, his eyes wide in the darkness. The security light flickered briefly, making the shadows on the porch dance. "The face," Papa continued, his voice dropping even lower, "that's what made me drop the broom handle. Wasn't a face like God intended faces to be. The skin was stretched too tight across the bones, no nose to speak of, just 2 holes like a skull. The mouth," he paused, swallowing hard. "The mouth was torn at the corners, like something had tried to make it wider, showing teeth that were all wrong, too sharp, too many, set in gums black as sin. But it was the eyes that really got me. When Benny's flashlight beam hit them, they lit up like a gator's eyes on the water. That orange-yellow shine that tells you you're looking at something that sees in the dark better than you ever will. Except gator eyes don't blink sideways, and they don't look at you with intelligence that's almost human, but not quite." Sarah's scientific mind was still trying to rationalize. Could it have been someone in a costume? Maybe kids playing a prank? Papa shook his head slowly. "Child, I've been on this earth a long time. Seen all manner of things God put here, and some things I reckon man made himself. But this wasn't anything meant for this world. When it looked at us, there was something ancient in those eyes, something that knew us better than we knew ourselves, and was just waiting to see what we'd do next. It made a sound then, not the mumbling we'd heard before, but a hiss that started low and built until it felt like it was coming from inside your own head. Sounded like steam escaping from the pits of hell itself. Then it moved. The porch had grown so quiet you could hear everyone's breathing. Someone inside the house turned on a light, its warm glow barely reaching us through the windows. 1 second it was standing there, the next it was down on all fours, but not like an animal would be. Its limbs were all twisted around, bones moving in ways bones shouldn't be able to move. It skittered off into the darkness like some kind of giant spider, leaving these wet marks on the ground that smoked slightly in the moonlight. Benny was the first to move. He turned and ran back into the camp, faster than I'd ever seen him move. And remember, this was a man who'd played football for LSU in his youth. I was right behind him. We slammed the door, locked it, pushed furniture against it, spent the rest of the night huddled in the middle of the room with every light we had burning, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally came up, Papa continued, his voice steadier now, we packed our things faster than we ever had before. Didn't even clean the fish we'd caught the day before. Just threw everything in the truck and left. The whole way home, we barely spoke. What was there to say? He took a final sip of his watery tea, ice cubes clinking against his teeth. We went back to that camp during hunting season when we had rifles with us, but only in daylight, never after dark. Sometimes, especially on hot summer nights like this, we'd hear that same hiss coming from the swamp. Not close, but close enough. 3 years later, when Benny's diabetes got bad, we sold the camp, told everybody it was because of his health, and that wasn't exactly a lie. But the truth is, neither of us could stand being out there anymore, knowing that thing was somewhere in the darkness, watching and waiting. Papa leaned back in his rocker, his eyes distant. Benny went to be with the Lord 2 years ago, never having told anyone else about what we saw. Before he passed, he made me promise to warn people about what's out there, not to scare them, but to make them understand. There are things in this world that don't fit into our neat Sunday school lessons about creation. You see, Papa said, looking at each of us in turn, the Bible tells us God made man in his image and gave us dominion over all the beasts of the field. But it doesn't say he didn't make other things too. Things that might look like men but ain't. Things that were here long before us and might be here long after. He stopped rocking, leaning forward one last time. So, when you're out there in the swamp, remember this. Humans don't have eye shine. We're not made for the darkness. If you're out there at night and see something that looks human but isn't quite right, don't try to rationalize it. Don't try to make it make sense. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can. The porch was silent for a long moment after Papa finished. Inside, we could hear the adults starting to call for us. It was getting late. But none of us moved immediately, all processing what we'd heard. One more thing, Papa added as we started to get up. If you're ever out on Bayou Lafourche at night and everything goes quiet, not just quiet like normal, but that heavy kind of quiet that feels like the whole world is holding its breath, get out of there. Because that thing is still out there, still watching, still waiting. And not everything that walks on 2 legs is meant to be seen by human eyes. Years later, none of us who heard that story have ever gone night fishing on Bayou Lafourche. Some stories are more than just stories. They're warnings, passed down from those who've seen things they wish they hadn't, hoping to save others from the same fate. And sometimes, on hot summer nights when the air is thick with humidity and the cicadas go suddenly quiet, I think about what might be out there in the darkness, moving with joints that bend the wrong way, watching with eyes that shine like a gator's but think like a man's. And I thank God for Papa's warning, and pray I never have to see for myself what he and Benny encountered that night on the bayou. There's something liberating about riding a motorcycle at night. The world narrows down to the cone of your headlight, the rumble of the engine beneath you, and the rush of wind around your helmet. At 18, these midnight rides were my therapy, my way of sorting through the chaos in my head. I'd just finished my first semester at community college, and life felt like it was at a crossroads. My parents wanted me to study business, but my heart wasn't in it. These nocturnal excursions on my Kawasaki Ninja became my escape valve, a way to outrun my thoughts, if only temporarily. That particular night in October was perfect for riding, cool enough to keep you alert, warm enough to be comfortable in just a leather jacket. The moon was full, casting everything in that silvery light that makes familiar landscapes look alien and strange. I'd done the usual routine, basic safety check on the bike. Promised my parents I'd be careful. I'll be back eventually, my standard response. And headed out into the darkness. The highways around our town cut through dense forest. The kind of old growth that makes you think about what might have walked these lands before civilization carved its paths through the wilderness. During the day, these roads were busy with logging trucks and tourists heading to the national park. But at midnight, they belonged to me and whatever animals were brave enough to venture near the asphalt. I'd been riding for about 40 minutes, my mind finally starting to quiet down when I heard it. A sharp hissing sound that cut through the mechanical rhythm of my bike's engine. At first, I thought it was a problem with the motorcycle, maybe a vacuum leak or something worse. I pulled over onto the shoulder, the beam of my headlight creating a small island of visibility in the surrounding darkness. The proper thing would have been to leave my helmet on while checking the bike, but I wanted to use my phone's flashlight for a better look. As I lifted the helmet off, the night air hit my face, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else. Something wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. That's when I heard the hiss again. It wasn't coming from my bike. The sound emerged from the tree line about 30 feet away, where the manicured shoulder of the road surrendered to wilderness. My phone's flashlight seemed pathetically inadequate as I swept it toward the trees, more revealing shadows than dispersing them. The figure that stepped forward shouldn't have been possible. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, with proportions that violated everything I knew about human anatomy. Its body was a void, seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. But its face... God, its face was bone white, like a mask floating in darkness, except masks don't blink and masks don't smile with too many teeth. "Come here, boy." The voice struck me like a physical blow. It was wrong in ways I couldn't process, like someone had recorded human speech and was playing it back at slightly the wrong speed. But what terrified me most was how familiar it sounded. "Come here, son." It was my father's voice. Perfect in every detail, down to the slight Texas drawl he'd never quite lost. But my father was home, probably watching late-night History Channel documentaries like he always did. This thing, whatever it was using his voice like a lure. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my keys, trying to get them into the ignition. The Kawasaki's starter whined, but wouldn't catch, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the midnight silence. In my peripheral vision, I could see the figure taking measured steps toward me, each movement too fluid, too precise, like a predator that knows its prey is trapped. The white face seemed to float closer through the darkness, disconnected from the void-like body beneath it. As it approached, I could make out more details that my mind rebelled against processing. The eyes were too large, too round, like black mirrors reflecting nothing. The smile stretched impossibly wide, the corners of the mouth extending far beyond where any human mouth should end. And there was something wrong with the way it walked, a subtle wrongness in the rhythm of its steps, as if its legs were jointed in places that anatomy didn't allow for. "Son!" it called again in my father's voice. But now there was something else underlying the familiar tones, a sort of wet, clicking sound, like someone trying to talk with a mouth full of insects. "I've been waiting for you." The primitive part of my brain, the part that knows what to do when faced with something that defies reality, was screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to run to. The nearest town was 15 miles in either direction, and whatever this thing was, I had a feeling it could move faster than any human. I tried the starter again, sending up a desperate prayer to whatever might be listening. This time the engine caught, roaring to life with a sound that had never been more welcome. I didn't even wait to put my helmet back on, just tucked it under one arm, kicked the bike into gear, and twisted the throttle hard enough to lift the front wheel as I peeled away from the shoulder. In my mirrors, I caught one last glimpse of the figure. It had stopped moving forward and now stood perfectly still in the middle of the road. As I watched, its head rotated, not turned but rotated, a full 180 degrees to follow my retreat. Then I was around a curve, and the sight mercifully disappeared behind me. I rode home at speeds that would have given my mother a heart attack, taking corners so fast that my knee pads scraped the asphalt. The whole time, I kept expecting to see that white face appear in my mirrors again. Or worse, looming suddenly in front of me around a blind corner. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been some sort of hallucination brought on by fatigue and stress. That rationalization lasted until my mother came into the kitchen while I was trying to force down some breakfast. "Did you hear about what they found on Highway 23? She asked, her face pale as she looked at her phone. "A body. Right where you like to ride?" She looked up at me sharply. "You weren't out that way last night, were you?" The cereal in my mouth turned to ash. "Where exactly?" I managed to ask. She showed me the local news website on her phone. The article was sparse on details, but the location was clear enough, exactly where I'd had my encounter. The body had been discovered by an early morning jogger, but the article noted that, due to the condition of the remains, identification may take some time. That's when the full impact of what had happened hit me. That thing hadn't just been trying to scare me, it had been hunting. And if my bike hadn't started, I pushed away from the table and barely made it to the bathroom before losing what little breakfast I'd managed to eat. But the worst part wasn't the realization of how close I'd come to death. It was the creeping certainty that this wasn't over. Throughout the day, I kept seeing movement in the corners of my eyes, quick glimpses of something tall and dark with a white face. Each time I turned to look, nothing was there, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. That night, despite every rational part of my mind screaming against it, I knew I had to go back. Not to the exact same spot, I wasn't that crazy, but somewhere nearby. I had to know if what I'd seen was real, if it was still out there. This wasn't curiosity so much as a compulsion, like picking at a scab, even though you know you shouldn't. I chose a small roadside hotel about 5 miles from where I'd had my encounter. It was one of those 2-story places that had probably been nice in the 1980s, but had since descended into a kind of resigned shabbiness. The parking lot was barely half full, mostly commercial trucks whose drivers had stopped for the night. The clerk barely looked up from her phone as I checked in, just pushed a keycard across the worn counter and circled my room number on a photocopied map of the property. Room 217, 2nd floor, overlooking the parking lot where my Kawasaki sat under the harsh fluorescent lights. The room smelled of old cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, with that particular mustiness that comes from too many years of running the same air conditioner. I did a thorough check of the space, under the bed, behind the curtains, in the bathroom. Part of me knew I was being paranoid, but after what I'd seen the night before, paranoia felt like a reasonable response. I tried to sleep but couldn't. The ceiling had water stains that seemed to form patterns if you stared at them long enough. And every creak of the building's old bones made me tense. Around 2 a.m., I was still lying there fully clothed on top of the covers when I heard it, a gentle tapping on the window. Tap, tap, tap. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just a tree branch, but there were no trees near the building. Besides, the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Then my bike's alarm started wailing in the parking lot below. The sound jolted me into action. That alarm was expensive, sensitive enough to trigger if someone just brushed against the bike too hard. I grabbed my room key and phone, heading for the door before I could think better of it. The hotel's exterior walkway was dimly lit by yellow bug lights that created more shadows than illumination. Down in the parking lot, my bike sat exactly as I'd left it, the alarm now silent. I did a quick check, but nothing seemed disturbed. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew, without turning around, I knew that I wasn't alone. They stood at the edge of the parking lot, where the pavement met the tree line. 2 figures now, not just one. The original creature I'd seen was there, its white face gleaming in the artificial light. But beside it stood something even more terrifying, a similar figure but larger, its face more elongated, less attempt made at appearing human. Neither moved. They just stood there, watching me with those black mirror eyes. The taller one's head was cocked at an impossible angle, nearly upside down, like a curious dog trying to understand what it's looking at. But there was nothing dog-like about these creatures, nothing that connected them to any natural form of life. I backed away slowly, keeping them in sight. My room key slipped from my suddenly sweating palm, clattering on the asphalt. When I instinctively glanced down at the sound, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. By the time I looked up again, they had halved the distance between us without seeming to move. That's when the screaming started. It wasn't a human scream, or even an animal one. It was like someone had recorded the sound of metal tearing, mixed it with the shriek of winter wind through dead trees, and played it through broken speakers. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, bypassing my ears to vibrate directly in my skull. I ran. There was nothing else to do. No way to fight something that defied the laws of nature itself. I left my bike, left everything except my phone, and sprinted for the hotel stairs. The screaming followed me, changing pitch and tone in ways that made my teeth ache. As I reached my room, I risked a glance back. They were at the base of the stairs now, but moving differently. The smaller one was on all fours, but wrong. Its limbs bent in impossible directions, more like a spider than any mammal. The larger one remained upright, but had somehow grown even taller, its head nearly reaching the second-floor railing. Inside my room, I slammed the door and pushed the dresser against it. My motorcycle helmet sat on the bed where I'd left it, and in a moment of desperate inspiration, I put it on. Something about being inside it, behind the visor, made me feel marginally safer. The familiar smell of leather and sweat helped ground me in reality, even as that reality was being torn apart by whatever waited outside. The screaming stopped abruptly, replaced by something almost worse, a soft tapping on my window exactly like before. Then my father's voice again, but distorted now, like multiple voices speaking slightly out of sync. "Son, why are you hiding from us? We've been waiting so long. So very long." I huddled in the corner furthest from both the window and door, my phone clutched in my trembling hands. The signal bars had disappeared, though I had full coverage when I'd checked in. The clock on the phone showed 3:33 a.m., and as I watched, the digits began to blur and shift, showing impossible numbers and symbols. Something scraped against the window, long, sharp appendages that shouldn't exist, leaving trails in the glass itself. The white faces pressed against the pane, their features shifting and flowing like wax, melting in reverse. Their mouths opened wider than physically possible, revealing row upon row of needle-like teeth. I spent the rest of the night in that corner, my helmet on, eyes fixed on the window. The creatures never broke in, never did more than watch and occasionally tap or whisper. But somehow, that was worse than an attack. They were playing with me, I realized. Like a cat with a mouse, they were enjoying my terror. When dawn finally came, they were gone. I waited another hour to be sure, then grabbed my things and ran to my bike. I rode home well above the speed limit, taking back roads and jumping at every shadow. My father was in the kitchen when I got home, reading the morning paper like he did every day. He took one look at my face and set the paper down. "You saw them, didn't you?" he asked quietly. "The white faces." I collapsed into a chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. You know about them." He nodded slowly, pouring me a cup of coffee with hands that shook slightly. "Saw them first when I was about your age, out hunting in East Texas. Thought I was losing my mind. My father, your grandfather, he saw them too back in '62. It runs in families, son. They find us. Mark us somehow. What are they? Don't know. Don't want to know. Some things in this world aren't meant to be understood." He looked at me with an intensity I'd never seen before. "But I do know this. They're getting bolder, more of them showing up. And they're not just watching anymore." Despite my father's warning, or perhaps because of it, I couldn't stay locked in the house forever. A week after the hotel incident, my friend Mike invited me over to his place on the outskirts of town. He had 2 German shepherds, Tank and Rex, both former police dogs he'd adopted after they retired from service. Something about having those dogs around made me feel safer. Mike's property backed up to the state forest, miles of uninterrupted wilderness that stretched toward the mountains. I hadn't made the connection at first, but looking at a map later, I realized these woods eventually connected to the area where I'd first encountered the creatures. The forest was one continuous green mass, like a living thing with its own circulatory system of trails and animal paths. We spent the afternoon working on his truck, and before we knew it, the sun was setting. Mike suggested taking the dogs for their evening walk, something he did every day, usually armed because of the occasional bear or mountain lion. I agreed, probably against my better judgment, but the presence of the dogs and the Mossberg 500 shotgun I was carrying gave me a false sense of security. The dogs were different that evening. Tank, usually the more aggressive of the pair, kept his hackles raised, growling softly at shadows between the trees. Rex, typically the calm one, stayed pressed against my legs, his tail tucked, a clear sign of fear in a dog that had faced down armed criminals in his previous career. "They're acting weird," Mike observed, checking the magazine of his .45 for the third time. "Maybe we should head back." Before I could agree, we heard it, that same alien scream from the hotel, but louder now, more confident. It echoed through the trees, seeming to come from multiple directions at once. The dogs went rigid, their training warring with their instinct to flur. The figures emerged from the darkness like they were part of it, stepping out of shadows that weren't deep enough to hide them. 3 of them now. The 2 I'd seen before, plus a new one, this one so tall it had to bend almost double to move under the tree branches. Their white faces gleamed in the failing light, features shifting and flowing like smoke under glass. Mike didn't hesitate. He raised his pistol and fired 4 rounds in rapid succession. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space of the forest, but the creatures didn't even flinch. The bullets seemed to pass through them without effect, like shooting at mist. Then the largest one moved, covering the distance between us faster than anything that size should be able to move. Its face split open, revealing that nightmare array of teeth. And something else, a darkness behind them that seemed to go on forever. Like looking down the throat of the universe itself, I fired the shotgun reflexively, the blast nearly knocking me off my feet. The creature recoiled, not wounded but surprised, as if it hadn't expected resistance. That gave us the moment we needed. "Run!" I shouted, though Mike was already moving. The dogs took off ahead of us, their training forgotten in the face of something that defied natural law. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots trying to trip us in the growing darkness. Behind us, I could hear them coming. Not running exactly. The sound was more like something huge sliding through the trees, accompanied by that wet clicking noise I remembered from the highway. The screaming started again, but this time it had words in it. Sort of stay, play, become. We ran until our lungs burned, the dogs leading us through the darkness with their superior night vision. The creatures pursued us in a way that defied physics. Sometimes they seemed to be right behind us, their cold breath on our necks. Then they'd appear ahead of us, their white faces gleaming between the trees like terrible moons. The clicking sounds grew louder, accompanied by a new noise, a sort of wet, slithering sound that made me think of things better left in the depths of the ocean. The air had grown noticeably colder, our breath coming out in visible puffs despite the summer warmth from earlier. "The truck," Mike gasped between breaths. "It can't be. Much further." But the forest had become unfamiliar, the trails twisting in ways they hadn't before. Trees that we'd passed seemed to reappear, as if we were running in circles, despite maintaining a straight line. The creatures were playing with us, I realized. This was all part of their game. Tank and Rex suddenly stopped, both dogs growling at something ahead. In the beam of Mike's flashlight, we saw why. Our path was blocked by the tallest creature, its body seeming to merge with the darkness between the trees. Its face had split open completely now, the 2 halves hanging like pale curtains around that impossible void of a mouth. "Stay," it said again, the word emanating not from its mouth, but seemingly from the air around us. "Become part." Mike fired his remaining rounds directly into that darkness. The creature's response was a sound I'll never forget, like 1,000 voices screaming in frequencies human ears weren't meant to hear. The trees themselves seemed to bend away from it. I pumped the shotgun and fired again, not at the creature but at the ground between us. The blast kicked up dirt and leaves, temporarily obscuring its vision. In that moment of confusion, we broke right, crashing through a wall of undergrowth. By some miracle, we'd chosen the right direction. Mike's truck appeared through the trees, our salvation in the form of four-wheel drive steel. We piled in, the dogs leaping into the back seat. Mike's hands shook so badly he dropped the keys, but somehow managed to get them into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the creatures emerged from the forest. All three of them stood at the edge of the clearing, their bodies seeming to ripple and shift in the truck's headlights. The smallest one stepped forward, and for a moment its face looked exactly like my father's. Mike floored it in reverse, then spun the truck around in a move that would have made a stunt driver proud. As we sped away, I looked back one last time. The creatures had linked arms, forming a kind of arch with their bodies. Through that arch I caught a glimpse of something else. Another place, maybe. A place where the laws of physics and nature were more suggestions than rules. Then we were around the bend and the vision was gone. That was 3 years ago. I sold my motorcycle shortly after, no longer able to trust myself alone on dark roads. Mike moved to Arizona, about as far from deep forests as you can get. The dogs recovered, but they never went into those woods again. My father and I talk about it sometimes, late at night when Mom's asleep. He's told me more about his encounters, about what his father told him. It goes back generations in our family, he says. Some families have a history of heart disease or diabetes. Ours has this. These creatures, these things that watch and wait and sometimes take. They're getting bolder, he told me recently. More aggressive. Used to be they'd just watch, maybe try to lure you closer. Now, he shook his head, now they're hunting. I've done research since then, looked up similar encounters across the country. There are patterns. They appear more during full moons. They often mimic loved ones' voices. They seem to mark certain families for repeated encounters. But no one knows what they are or what they want. Some nights when I can't sleep, I think about that arch they formed, about what I saw through it. I think about how their faces shifted and changed, about the darkness behind their teeth. And I wonder if maybe they're not from somewhere else, but rather from here. From the spaces between what we think of as reality, the gaps in our understanding of the world. My father says knowledge is dangerous when it comes to these things. The more you try to understand them, the more attention you attract. But I can't help wondering, especially now that my wife is pregnant with our first child. Will this legacy pass to them? Will they one day find themselves alone on a dark road, hearing a familiar voice calling them into the shadows? All I can do is prepare them, warn them like my father warned me. If you hear something calling with a loved one's voice, don't answer. If you see a pale face watching from the darkness, don't look too long. And if you ever find yourself in the woods at night and everything goes quiet, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because they're still out there, still watching, still waiting. And they're getting hungrier. Michigan summers hold on to daylight like a miser clutching gold, especially in the northern reaches where the sun seems reluctant to surrender tonight. It was in this extended twilight, during the summer of 1999, that my then-fiancée, now wife of 16 years, and another couple found ourselves on the Pyramid Point Trail in Sleeping Bear Dunes. The trail wound through dense hardwood forest before opening dramatically onto a bluff overlooking Lake Michigan. At nearly 200 feet above the water, the overlook offered an unobstructed view of the Manitou Passage and its namesake islands in the distance. The elevation made you feel like you were hovering above the world, suspended between earth and sky. I carried my old film camera with its 200 mm zoom lens, hoping to capture the legendary sunset over the Manitou Islands. The camera had been a college graduation gift, and though digital photography was beginning to emerge, there was something reassuring about the mechanical certainty of film. The evening had that particular quality unique to northern Michigan summers, a crispness to the air that spoke of pine forests and fresh water mixed with the warmth of sun-baked sand. High winds pushed waves against the shoreline far below, creating a constant rhythm of crash and retreat that seemed to match our heartbeats. The forest behind us creaked and swayed, branches moving like dancers in the strengthening wind, while ahead of us stretched the vast expanse of Lake Michigan, its waters darkening as dusk settled over the landscape. Having spent my childhood summers in this region, I knew the lake's moods intimately, how it could shift from mirror calm to tempestuous within hours, how its waters could hide secrets beneath deceptively peaceful surfaces. Tonight, the 5-meter waves breaking against the distant shore were a common sight, their white caps visible even in the fading light, a reminder of the lake's raw power. By 10 o'clock, the sun had finally surrendered, leaving behind a palette of deep purples and blues that seemed to blur the boundary between sky and water. The Manitou Passage stretched before us, a 7-mile-wide channel of dark water that had claimed countless ships over the centuries. Somewhere out there, the North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse stood guard, though its automated light was barely visible in the gathering darkness. The lighthouse had always fascinated me, a solitary structure rising from the water, no longer staffed but still serving its purpose, a testament to human determination to master these treacherous waters. The 4 of us stood at the overlook, our conversation drifting between topics as naturally as the clouds above us. We discussed our upcoming camping plans, the peculiarities of northern Michigan weather, and the history of the passage before us. My fiancée, wrapped in a fleece jacket against the cooling air, pointed out the various spots where shipwrecks lay hidden beneath the waves. The other couple, experienced sailors themselves, shared stories of their own adventures on these waters, though always in more forgiving conditions than tonight's choppy surface suggested. The first flash came during a lull in conversation, a brief burst of light out on the water that seemed to pierce the gathering darkness like a needle through cloth. The timing was odd. Most pleasure craft would have sought harbor hours ago, given the building winds and roughening water. Commercial vessels typically stayed in the deeper shipping lanes further out, their running lights visible for miles. This light was different, focused, intentional, and somewhere between the mainland and the islands, where no regular traffic should be. I had brought the old film camera more out of habit than any real expectation of night photography. The 200mm zoom lens had served me well over the years, capturing everything from wildlife to distant sailboats, but tonight it would become something far more important than a mere photographic tool. Raising it to my eye, I struggled to steady the lens against the gusting wind, trying to locate the source of that mysterious flash. Through the viewfinder, the world narrowed to a small circle of twilight, within which I could just make out what appeared to be a small vessel. Though at this distance, and in the failing light, details were frustratingly difficult to discern. We all carried hiking flashlights, nothing particularly powerful, just standard LED models meant for illuminating forest trails and finding your way back to camp after sunset. They seemed woefully inadequate for communicating across miles of open water, but in that moment they were all we had. Without really expecting results, we aimed them toward the source of the mysterious light and flashed them several times, more in hope than expectation. The wind continued to gust around us, and the waves below crashed against the base of the cliff with increasing force, creating a constant background roar that seemed to emphasize our isolation on this wild shoreline. The response to our feeble light signals came with shocking immediacy. 3 short flashes. 3 long, 3 short again. The universal distress signal burned through the darkness like an accusation. A casual evening of stargazing transformed instantly into something far more grave. The pattern repeated, followed by a series of structured flashes that could only be Morse code, a language none of us could read, but whose desperate urgency we all understood. The realization hit us with physical force. We were watching someone in serious trouble, separated from them by miles of violent water and gathering darkness. The decision to split up came naturally. My fiancée and I would sprint back to the car for supplies, while our friends maintained visual contact with the vessel. The half-mile trail through the woods, which had been a pleasant hike up, now became a treacherous obstacle course. Our flashlight beams bounced wildly as we ran, transforming familiar trees into looming shadows. The steep descent, already challenging in daylight, became a controlled fall in the darkness. Roots and rocks conspired to trip us. Branches whipped at our faces, and the entire forest seemed to resist our urgent passage. We reached the car, breathless and fumbling with keys. The late 90s cell phone lay in the glove compartment, a brick of a device that now represented someone's best hope for survival. In the trunk, a pair of binoculars nestled in their case, forgotten until this crucial moment. The dash clock read 10:17 p.m., a detail that would stick in my memory, marking the moment we moved from observers to participants in what was unfolding on the water. The call to the Coast Guard was an exercise in fighting against poor reception and the limitations of pre-GPS technology. We struggled to convey our exact location and what we were witnessing. The dispatcher's voice remained professionally calm, but her rapid-fire questions revealed the seriousness of the situation. How many flashes? What was the interval? Could we estimate the vessel's position relative to the lighthouse? Had we seen any other boats in the area? Each question underscored how little we actually knew about what was happening out there in the darkness. The run back up the trail seemed twice as long, every second stretched by the knowledge that someone's life might depend on our return. The binoculars bounced against my chest, and the phone kept losing signal as we climbed higher. By the time we crested the final rise, sweat plastered our clothes to our backs despite the cool night air. Our friends' faces told us something had changed. In the 20 minutes we'd been gone, the situation had deteriorated. Through the binoculars, we could now make out details that turned our concern to horror. An aluminum rowboat, pathetically small against the massive waves, with a single occupant fighting against conditions that would challenge even a properly equipped vessel. The boat would appear on the crest of a wave, then vanish into the trough, each disappearance lasting longer than the last. The mystery of why someone would be out there in such a small craft only added to the mounting tension. The SOS signals came more frequently now, each flash sequence punctuated by periods of darkness during which we could only imagine the struggle taking place. We established a rhythm. They would signal, we would respond with our flashlights, a brief confirmation that someone still watched, still cared, still sought help. But our lights felt impossibly inadequate, like trying to empty the lake with a teaspoon. Through the binoculars, each glimpse of the struggling boat became more harrowing than the last. The occupant alternated between rowing with desperate energy and turning to signal us, each movement speaking of exhaustion and growing desperation. The waves had developed a malevolent rhythm, lifting the small craft skyward before plunging it into valleys of black water. Every time the boat disappeared into a trough, we held our breath, counting seconds until it reappeared. Sometimes the wait stretched so long that we began to fear the worst, only to see the tiny vessel emerge again, somehow still afloat. The wind had intensified, carrying the deep-throated roar of waves crashing against the cliffs below us. Clouds scudded across the moon, alternatively brightening and darkening the scene before us. Each time the moonlight broke through, we could see the rowboat had drifted further north, caught in the passage's notorious current. The sailor was fighting not just the waves, but also the inexorable pull of the water. Each stroke of the oars, a battle against forces that had claimed countless larger vessels throughout the centuries. Our attempt to maintain phone contact with the Coast Guard became an exercise in frustration. The overlook's elevation that gave us such a clear view of the unfolding drama also played havoc with cell reception. We discovered a single spot, precariously close to the cliff's edge, where the phone would show one bar of signal. Taking turns, we would stand there, shouting updates into the phone while bracing against the wind. The Coast Guard's responses were professional but increasingly terse. A vessel was en route, they assured us, but the conditions were challenging, and the search area was vast. the passage of time became distorted, marked only by the rhythmic flashing of SOS signals and our responses. Each flash sequence revealed subtle changes in the boat's situation. It was riding lower in the water now, the waves breaking over its bow more frequently. Through the binoculars, we could see the occupant constantly bailing, each pause in rowing threatening to swamp the small craft. The distance between signals grew longer, whether from exhaustion or the need to focus on survival. We couldn't tell. Around us, the darkness of a northern Michigan night had fully descended, but it wasn't the complete darkness of inland areas. The water seemed to hold and reflect what little light remained, creating a ghostly illumination that transformed the passage into something ancient and unknowable. The waves were black mountains now, their white caps appearing and disappearing like phantom lights, creating a disorienting effect that made it increasingly difficult to maintain visual contact with the boat. Near 11 o'clock, we heard it, the deep thrum of powerful engines cutting through the night. A tugboat appeared from the southern end of the passage, its searchlight cutting a brilliant white arc through the darkness. The vessel moved in a methodical pattern, sweeping back and forth across the water in a grid formation that spoke of professional search and rescue techniques. We tried signaling it with our flashlights, attempting to direct it toward where we'd last seen the rowboat. But our lights seemed pitifully weak against the vastness of the lake. The tugboat's appearance was soon followed by the arrival of a Coast Guard vessel from the northern end of the passage, its distinctive red stripe barely visible in the darkness. The two ships created a choreography of light and shadow across the water, their searchlights cutting through the night like giant scythes. The methodical nature of their search pattern was both reassuring and maddening. Reassuring because it spoke of professional rescue protocols. Maddening because we knew the rowboat had drifted significantly north of their initial search area. The night had grown preternaturally cold for a Michigan summer, the wind carrying a bite that seemed to cut through our jackets. We huddled together at the overlook, passing the binoculars between us, each taking turns, scanning the increasingly turbulent waters. The moon played cruel tricks, every whitecap potentially the lost boat, every shadow possibly a human figure. Our flashlights had grown noticeably dimmer, the batteries weakening from constant use, yet we continued to signal periodically, maintaining our vigil even though we'd lost sight of our target. The passage, nearly 7 miles wide and equally long, had become a vast black theater of possibilities. The rescue vessel's searchlights revealed tantalizingly brief glimpses of the water's surface. A floating log here, a cluster of debris there, but no sign of the aluminum boat or its occupant. The waves had grown larger, their crests now regularly broken by the wind into sheets of spray that further reduced visibility. The sound of the water below us had changed too, developing a deeper, more threatening note that seemed to resonate in our bones. Around midnight, we witnessed a scene that would haunt our dreams for years to come. The Coast Guard vessel's searchlight swept across a particular section of water, illuminating what appeared to be an upturned boat. The light lingered for several heartbeats, but before the ship could maneuver closer, the object, if that's what it was, disappeared into the trough of a wave. When the beam returned to that location, nothing remained. We found ourselves holding our breath, willing the light to reveal something, anything. But the water remained obstinately empty. The tugboat had moved further north, following the current's natural flow, its searchlight methodically dissecting the darkness. The coordination between the two vessels was impressive, their paths interlocking to cover maximum area while maintaining safe distances in the challenging conditions. But as the hours wore on, their search patterns began to expand, moving further apart, suggesting they were transitioning from an active rescue operation to a wider search effort. Our own helplessness became increasingly difficult to bear. We had maintained our position at the overlook for nearly 3 hours, our earlier panic giving way to a deep, gnawing dread. The mystery of why someone would be out in a rowboat on such a night, so far from shore, plagued our thoughts. Was it a foolhardy attempt to reach the lighthouse? A fishing trip gone terribly wrong? Or something more sinister? The lack of answers only intensified our sense of responsibility as the only witnesses to this unfolding drama. By 1 in the morning, the search patterns of both vessels had changed significantly. Their movements became wider, less urgent, the methodical grid system dissolving into broader sweeps across the passage. The tugboat had moved so far north it was becoming difficult to distinguish its searchlight from the occasional glimmer of distant lightning on the horizon. The Coast Guard vessel maintained a closer position, but its search pattern suggested they no longer expected to find someone alive in the water. The temperature had dropped further, and the wind carried the first hints of an approaching weather system. The moon had disappeared behind a bank of clouds, leaving only the artificial illumination of the rescue vessels to pierce the darkness. Each sweep of their searchlights revealed the increasing turbulence of the water, waves now regularly topping 6 meters, their faces streaked with wind-thrown foam. The conditions that had seemed challenging earlier now appeared absolutely lethal. Our vigil had taken on a different character. The initial adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. We took turns walking back to the car to warm up, though none of us could bear to be away from the overlook for long. The fear of missing something, a light, a signal, any sign of life, kept drawing us back to our post despite the increasingly hostile conditions. The North Manitou Shoal Lighthouse, which had played such a crucial role in the evening's events, continued its automated blinking, indifferent to the drama unfolding in its waters. Its regular pattern seemed almost mocking now, a reminder of how close, yet impossibly far, safety had been for the person in the rowboat. The lighthouse's solitary beam swept across waters that might now hold another secret, another story to join the countless others lost in the passage's depths. Just before 2 in the morning, we watched the Coast Guard vessel make one final pass near the shoreline before turning south. The tugboat had already disappeared into the darkness to the north. The systematic search that had given us hope hours earlier had concluded without fanfare, without answers, without closure. The darkness that rushed in to fill the void left by their searchlights seemed absolute, as if the lake itself was drawing a curtain over the night's events. We made our way to the small tavern in Glen Arbor, hoping to find someone who might have heard something about the incident. The place was nearly empty, just a few locals nursing late-night drinks. The television above the bar showed nothing but late-night programming. No breaking news, no emergency bulletins, no indication that anything unusual had occurred on the lake. It was as if the entire event had been a shared hallucination, except for the bone-deep exhaustion we all felt, and the lingering image of that solitary light, flashing SOS into the darkness. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the lake's surface deceptively calm, showing no evidence of the previous night's drama. We called the Coast Guard station as soon as they opened, our voices hoarse from the night's shouting. The dispatcher who answered seemed to have no knowledge of the incident. Due to shift changes, she explained, she couldn't provide any information about the search operation or its outcome. Our detailed description of events was met with professional courtesy, but no answers. The local newspapers carried no reports of missing persons or recovered boats. The Maritime Bulletin Board at the Harbour Master's office showed no notices about the incident. It was as if the events we'd witnessed had been swallowed by the lake, along with whatever secrets it might have claimed that night. The only proof we had were the dying batteries in our flashlights and the haunting images burned into our memories. Over the following days, we found ourselves returning to the overlook at different times, drawn back by some inexplicable need for closure. The passage looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more navigable. Pleasure boats cruised between the islands and mainland, their passengers unaware they were crossing what might be someone's final resting place. The North Manitou Shoal lighthouse stood stark against the blue sky, its automated signal now barely visible in the sunlight, offering no clues about what it had witnessed. The experience changed us in subtle but permanent ways. When the passage appears in the news now, reports of rough weather, missing boats, or successful rescues, we find ourselves transported back to that night. Every detail remains vivid. The desperate flash of SOS signals, the sound of waves against the cliffs, the gradually expanding search patterns of the rescue vessels, and the ultimate silence that followed. 16 years have passed since that night, but certain questions still haunt me. Who was the person in the rowboat? What desperate circumstance led them to be out there in such conditions? Did they somehow make it to safety, or did the lake add another story to its vast collection of mysteries? During summer visits to the area, I sometimes find myself scanning the water's surface, half expecting to see a light flashing in the darkness. The Manitou Passage continues its ancient rhythms, unperturbed by the dramas that play out on its surface. Lake Michigan holds its secrets close, and for every story that ends with a successful rescue, there are others that conclude only in questions. The incident has become part of the local lore. One more tale of the lake's power and mystery, whispered about in harborside bars and around campfires. When I look at the lake now, especially during those long summer twilights, I think about how thin the line is between safety and disaster, between being a witness and being a helpless observer. The weight of those hours spent on the overlook has never fully lifted. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, I find myself drawn to the window, watching for lights in the distance, remembering how it felt to be someone's only connection to hope, and wondering if somewhere out there someone else is standing watch, holding a light against the darkness. Time moves differently when you're young. The 2-day drive from Washington State to Minnesota stretched like an eternity in the back seat of our 1972 Pontiac Catalina, its vinyl seats sticking to my legs in the summer heat. The landscape outside morphed from the evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest to the endless prairies of the Midwest. Each mile marker a countdown to what I considered my second home, my cousin's century-old farm. Before my father's back injury when I was 9, these summer pilgrimages were as reliable as the seasons themselves. We'd pack the car with snacks and pillows, my mother's carefully organized road maps spread across the dashboard like battle plans. The Catalina's radio would fade in and out as we crossed state lines, picking up local stations that offered windows into lives and places we'd never see. My father would sing along to whatever came through the static, his voice competing with the wind rushing through the partially opened windows. The farm itself existed in my mind as a collection of perfect moments. The creak of the hayloft ladder in the old red barn, the musty smell of ancient railroad boxcars repurposed as storage, the taste of fresh strawberries picked from the garden. Every summer added new layers to these memories, like rings in a tree trunk, marking my growth against the unchanging backdrop of rural Minnesota. But returning at 12, after a 3-year absence, felt like stepping into a familiar photograph, only to find all the colors had shifted. The farm was exactly as I remembered it. The weathered red barn still stood sentinel over fields of corn and soybeans, the ancient boxcars still rusted in their appointed places. But my perception had changed. The spaces that once seemed vast now felt smaller. The adventures that had thrilled me now seemed childish. The black and white TV in the living room, once ignored in favor of outdoor exploration, now drew me like a magnet. Billy Joel records replaced the sound of wind in the cornfields as my preferred soundtrack. Conversations about sports and music pushed aside the old games of kick the can and tag. I was caught in that awkward space between childhood and adolescence, too old for the simple pleasures that had once defined these visits, too young to fully understand what I was leaving behind. It was during one of those listless summer mornings when boredom had driven me to count the cracks in the kitchen ceiling. that my cousin mentioned the forgotten graveyard. The words cut through my adolescent indifference like a knife. Here, finally, was something that spoke to my newly developing sense of the mysterious, something that didn't feel like a recycled childhood adventure. The plan came together over breakfast. We would pack sandwiches, take water bottles, and set out early the next morning. The adults, accustomed to our wanderings and satisfied that we were at least getting outside, asked few questions. Minnesota summers granted long days of light, but we still wanted to make the most of our expedition. Dawn found us in the farm's kitchen, assembling our provisions with the serious attention of Arctic explorers. The morning air carried that particular Midwestern summer quality, already humid at first light, promising a day of thick heat. We moved through dewdrops as big as marbles, our shoes quickly soaked from the tall grass. The landscape we crossed felt both familiar and foreign. Cornfields stretched toward the horizon, their rows creating valleys and canyons that only children could fully appreciate. We passed abandoned quarries, their limestone walls bleached white by countless summers, holding pools of water so clear you could see straight to the bottom. The woods appeared in patches, islands of shadow in the ocean of farmland. We stopped for lunch beside one of Minnesota's countless unnamed lakes. These bodies of water, scattered across the state like mirrors dropped from the sky, each held their own mysteries. This one was small, perhaps a quarter-mile across, its surface broken occasionally by fish-seeking insects. We ate our sandwiches in comfortable silence, watching dragonflies patrol the shoreline. The graveyard, when we finally found it, didn't announce itself with dramatic fences or stone gates. Instead, nature had reclaimed it almost completely. A massive rose bush, gone wild over decades, had grown into a natural cathedral over the graves. Its thorny branches created a dome that blocked most of the sunlight, casting everything beneath in a green-tinted twilight. Entering required careful navigation through gaps in the thorny canopy. The temperature dropped noticeably inside, as if we'd stepped into a different season altogether. The first tombstone I saw stopped me in my tracks. The date carved into the weathered stone placed its occupant's death in 1863, during the height of the Civil War. The inscription was still legible, though lichen had started to claim the edges of the letters. More stones emerged from the shadows as my eyes adjusted. They all bore the same surname, Anderson, with dates spanning nearly 50 years. These weren't just random burials. This was a family's history, written in stone, a chronicle of lives lived and lost on this very land. Farmers who had broken the prairie soil, planted the first crops, raised children, and eventually returned to the earth they had worked so hard to tame. Then my cousin pointed to an area deeper within the Rose Cathedral, his voice dropping to a whisper as if afraid to disturb the silence. What I saw there changed something fundamental in my understanding of life and death. 7 small tombstones stood in a perfect row, each topped with a carefully carved lamb. The stones were smaller than the others, sized to match their occupants, and the sight of them hit me with physical force. The dates told a story more terrible than any horror movie I'd sneaked watching on late-night TV. 7 children, all taken within weeks of each other in the winter of 1878. The oldest was 11, the youngest barely 2. The inscriptions spoke of beloved sons and cherished daughters, of angels called home too soon, of hearts broken beyond repair. Smallpox or scarlet fever, the killer wasn't named, but its devastation was carved in stone. Standing there, the humid Minnesota summer seemed very far away. I could almost see the scene, the frozen ground having to be broken repeatedly as the disease claimed child after child, the parents' grief turning as hard and cold as the winter itself. These weren't just historical facts. These were real children who had played in the same fields we'd just crossed, who had perhaps watched the same dragonflies dance over the same unnamed lake. A sudden breeze stirred the roses above us, sending dappled shadows dancing across the small stones. The lambs seemed to move in the shifting light, their stone faces wearing expressions that shifted between peace and sorrow. The silence in the grove grew heavier, more expectant, as if the very air was holding its breath. My previous excitement about discovering something cool had evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of trespass. We weren't explorers here. We were intruders, disturbing a place of deep and private grief. The carefully maintained grave markers, the loving inscriptions, the symbolic lambs all spoke of a family's attempt to maintain connection with their lost children, to create a sacred space where their memory could live on. The journey back to the farm took on a different character. The same landscape we'd crossed so eagerly that morning now seemed overlaid with shadows of the past. Every old farmhouse we passed could have held similar stories of loss and grief. The unnamed lake where we'd eaten lunch might have witnessed countless scenes of both joy and sorrow across the decades. The approaching thunderstorm matched our somber mood, its dark clouds building in the west like mountains. The cornfields whispered with increasing urgency as the wind picked up, and we quickened our pace. By the time the farm appeared on the horizon, its familiar silhouette was backed by storm clouds the color of bruises. Dinner that evening passed in unusual silence. The approaching storm had turned the kitchen windows into dark mirrors, occasionally lit by distant lightning. The adults attempted normal conversation, but something in our demeanor must have communicated that we'd experienced something profound. When asked about our day, I found myself offering only the most basic responses, unable to put into words the weight of what we'd discovered. The farmhouse itself seemed different that night. The familiar creaks and settling sounds of the century-old structure took on new meaning. Every shadow in the corners, every darkened doorway seemed to hold possibilities I'd never considered before. The stairs to my cousin's bedroom, which I'd climbed hundreds of times, suddenly felt steeper, longer, more significant. We retreated to the bedroom earlier than usual, neither of us interested in the usual evening activities. The storm was building in earnest now, the wind making the old windows rattle in their frames. Lightning flickered more frequently, each flash illuminating the farmyard below in stark, photographic moments. The thunder grew closer, its deep rumbles seeming to emanate from the earth itself rather than the sky. Then, between the thunder's growls, we heard it, a sound that didn't belong to any storm. A low, mournful moaning that seemed to weave through the wind like a thread of darker sound. At first, I tried to rationalize it as the wind finding some odd angle of the house or barn. But the sound had too much purpose, too much emotion. To be merely mechanical, I moved to the window, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The farmyard below was transformed by the storm into something unknown and ancient. Wind whipped through the grass, creating patterns like waves on a dark sea. The old barn's door swung back and forth, its hinges crying out in protest. Then came a flash of lightning that burned everything into sharp relief. In that frozen moment of illumination, they were there, small figures darting across the yard, moving in ways that denied both physics and reason. Their movements had a peculiar quality, like watching old film footage played at the wrong speed. Some seemed to float just above the grass, while others moved with the jerky randomness of wind-blown leaves. But they were unmistakably children. I grabbed my cousin, needing confirmation that I wasn't hallucinating. Another lightning flash revealed the scene again. More figures now, closer to the house, their forms becoming clearer. They wore clothes from another century, their faces pale as milk in the electric light. Most disturbing was their behavior. They seemed to be playing, engaging in some terrible parody of the games we'd played in that same yard during countless summer days. We stood frozen at the window, neither of us able to move or speak. The rational part of my mind kept trying to find explanations, tricks of the light, shadows from the swaying trees. Our imagination overwrought from the day's discovery. But each lightning flash destroyed these comfortable explanations, showing us things that couldn't exist but undeniably did. The storm moved closer, its lightning now near constant, providing an unsettling strobe light effect of the scene below. The children's movements became more distinct, more purposeful. They played games we recognized: tag, hide and seek, the same timeless activities that had entertained generations of children on this farm. But there was something wrong about their movements, as if they were performing these games from memory rather than joy. The moaning sound grew louder, resolving itself into something that might have been singing, a warped version of old hymns or lullabies, the kind that might have been sung over small graves in a winter long past. The wind carried the sound in waves, sometimes clear enough to almost make out words, then fading into the storm's deeper voices. Eventually, we retreated to our beds, leaving the lights on like a barrier against the impossible. But sometime in the night, I awoke to darkness. Either the power had failed or someone had turned off the lights. The storm had moved directly overhead, but the thunder couldn't mask the new sounds that filled the room. Footsteps, light and quick, pattered across the wooden floor. They moved with the random energy of children at play, back and forth, around and around. The air had grown impossibly cold, each breath visible in the darkness. My cousin slept on, oblivious, leaving me alone with whatever had followed us home from that rose-covered grove. The overwhelming emotion wasn't fear, though fear was certainly present. Instead, I felt a deep, crushing sadness, an echo of the grief that had been carved into those small tombstones. It pressed against my chest like a physical weight, bringing tears to my eyes that I couldn't explain. The footsteps grew closer to my bed, accompanied by sounds that might have been whispers or might have been the rustle of old-fashioned clothing. In that moment, facing something beyond my understanding, I did the only thing I could think of. I apologized. The words came unbidden, a child's attempt to make right an unknown wrong. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the darkness. I'm sorry." My whispered apologies continued into the darkness, each one feeling more meaningful than the last. The footsteps slowed, then paused as if listening. The crushing sadness in the room began to shift, transforming into something else. Not quite peace, but perhaps acceptance. Gradually, the pattering steps moved away, growing fainter until they merged with the storm's receding rumbles. Morning arrived with the particular clarity that follows summer storms in Minnesota. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the night's events feel like a shared dream. But at breakfast, reality reasserted itself in an unexpected way. My aunt, serving pancakes with practiced efficiency, casually asked if we'd been running around upstairs during the night. "We heard children playing," my uncle added, buttering his toast. "Thought you two were up there raising a ruckus." He said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather, but something in his tone suggested he knew better. The farm had been in his family for generations. How many nights had he lain awake, listening to those same footsteps? My cousin and I exchanged glances but said nothing. How could we explain what we'd witnessed? How could we describe the impossible sight of long-dead children playing in the storm-swept yard, or the sound of their phantom footsteps across ancient floorboards? Some experiences defy explanation, existing in the spaces between what we know and what we feel. That day, everything on the farm looked different. The familiar buildings and fields now seemed layered with history, each corner potentially holding echoes of past lives and losses. The old boxcars, the barn's hayloft, the worn paths between buildings, all had been witness to generations of children playing, living and sometimes dying far too young. Looking back now, I understand that what we encountered wasn't meant to frighten us. Those small spirits, if that's what they were, weren't seeking to cause harm. Perhaps they were drawn to our youth, to our carefree exploration of places they had once known. Or maybe our disturbance of their resting place had awakened memories that refused to stay buried beneath the wild roses. The rest of that summer took on a different character. We still played and explored, but with a new awareness of those who had come before us. The farm was no longer just a place of childhood adventures. It had become a bridge between past and present. A reminder that every patch of earth holds its own stories of joy and sorrow. Years later, I tried to find that overgrown graveyard again. The landscape had changed, fields had been replanted, old paths had disappeared, new fences had been erected. The massive rose bush was gone, probably cleared for farming, taking with it the physical reminder of that family's tragedy. But sometimes, on storm-dark nights, I still hear echoes of those phantom footsteps and remember the lessons learned that summer about the thin line between past and present. Between the world we see and the one we sense but cannot prove, the farm still stands, passing to new generations who add their own layers of history to its worn floorboards and weathered walls. I've never told my children about what happened that night, but someday, when they're old enough to understand, I'll take them to Minnesota. We'll walk those fields under the endless summer sky, and I'll teach them that some places hold more than just memories. They hold the very essence of those who came before, their joys and sorrows forever echoing through the quiet moments between storms.